The fork hit the plate with a sound sharp enough to cut through the morning silence. "You're fired." Damien Ashcroft didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that had ended careers, shattered alliances, and, on more than one occasion, ended lives. His cold gray eyes fixed on the man standing across the dining table, watching for the familiar signs of collapse, the stammering apology, the frantic pleading, the desperate scramble to salvage what couldn't be saved. What he got instead was a slow, deliberate blink. Liam Bennett didn't flinch. He didn't tremble. He didn't even set down the serving tray with anything less than perfect composure. The Omega chef simply tilted his head, studying Damien with the same patient expression he wore when inspecting a cut of meat or testing the temperature of a sauce. Then, without a word, he reached for the strings of his apron. The silk cord slipped through his fingers with quiet precision. He folded the white fabric once, twice, 3 times. Each movement unhurried, each crease immaculate. The apron settled beside the untouched breakfast plate, a silent monument to the 2 hours Liam had spent preparing the meal that now sat forgotten. "Perfect," Liam said softly. Something flickered behind his calm gray-green eyes. Not anger, not hurt, something far more unsettling. "I quit." The words landed like a grenade in the middle of the dining room. Every servant in attendance froze mid-motion. A young footman dropped the silver coffee pot he'd been carrying, the crash echoing through the cavernous space like a gunshot. One of the senior bodyguards, a man who'd survived 3 assassination attempts and never once broken composure, actually stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster before he caught himself. Someone near the back of the room whispered a prayer. The sound carried in the silence. For 15 years, Damien Ashcroft had built his empire on those 2 words. "You're fired." He'd spoken them to lieutenants who'd failed him, to business partners who'd betrayed him, to employees who'd disappointed him. No one had ever answered by walking away first. No one had ever looked at him with that quiet, devastating calm, and simply refused to play the game. Liam picked up the worn canvas bag that always sat beside the kitchen door. It was frayed at the edges, the strap held together with careful stitching that looked like it had been done by hand. He'd carried that bag every morning for 2 years, arriving before dawn with fresh produce and a stubbornness that had become legendary among the household staff. "You don't get to leave." Damien's voice came out rougher than intended, the words escaping before he could stop them. Liam paused at the threshold. For a moment, Damien thought he'd won. Thought the Omega would turn around, offer some concession, give him the submission he'd been conditioned to expect. Instead, Liam spoke without turning. "You're 30 seconds too late." The door closed behind him with a soft click. The mansion fell into a silence so complete that Damien could hear his own heartbeat. It was pounding in his ears, a frantic rhythm that didn't match the cold control he'd cultivated over decades of power. He stood frozen at the head of the table, surrounded by expensive china and crystal goblets and the wreckage of what should have been a routine morning. Then he did something no one inside the Ashcroft estate had ever witnessed. He ran. The oak doors of the dining room swung open as Damien crashed through them, his tailored suit jacket flapping behind him. Servants scattered like startled birds. His head of security shouted something incoherent. None of it registered. All he could see was the back of that worn canvas bag disappearing through the main entrance, the fall of broad shoulders beneath a simple gray sweater, the confident stride of a man who had just walked away from the most powerful alpha in the city. By the time Damien reached the marble steps outside, the street was empty. Liam was gone. No one inside the Ashcroft estate could remember exactly when the rules had stopped applying to the Omega in the kitchen. The rules were simple. Never keep the boss waiting. Never interrupt him when he was working. Never tell him he was wrong. Most importantly, never argue. Hundreds of employees had learned those lessons the hard way. Some lasted years. Some lasted weeks. A few didn't even survive their first day before quietly disappearing from the payroll. Yet every morning, one man walked through the mansion's back entrance carrying 2 oversized grocery bags, as though he owned the place. Liam Bennett had been hired 2 years ago, recommended by a chef who'd briefly worked in the Ashcroft kitchens before being dismissed for some minor infraction. He'd arrived with a stack of references, a quiet demeanor, and an unshakable confidence that had immediately grated on Damien's nerves. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered and sturdy, with calloused hands that moved with surgical precision and a stubborn streak that defied every instinct Damien possessed. As an Omega, Liam should have been deferential, submissive, eager to please. Instead, he'd walked into the most feared household in the city and proceeded to treat Damien Ashcroft like a particularly difficult recipe. "I don't eat breakfast," Damien had told him on the first morning. "I know," Liam had replied, sliding a plate onto the table. "That's why I made it. There's coffee. I don't need anything else." "Your hands are shaking." Damien had looked down at his own fingers, surprised to find them trembling. The realization had infuriated him. "That's none of your business. It is when you're paying me to keep you alive." Liam had smiled, a small, infuriating smile that had made Damien want to fire him on the spot. "Eat. You'll feel better." "What makes you think I want to feel better?" "I don't think you want anything. I think you're too stubborn to admit you need things." That had been the first argument. There had been hundreds more. By 7 o'clock on the morning of Liam's departure, the kitchen had already come alive. Pans hissed. Fresh bread filled the air with warmth. Coffee beans crackled inside the grinder. The staff moved with military precision because they all knew one truth. If breakfast wasn't perfect, someone would be blamed. Unfortunately for them, the boss almost never ate it. When Liam carried the tray into the dining room, he found Damien exactly where he expected, still wearing yesterday's suit, tie loosened, eyes fixed on a stack of reports. A cup of black coffee sat beside him, already half empty. The untouched plate of eggs, fresh fruit, and warm toast was ignored entirely. "Another," Damien said, not looking up. "Another what?" Liam's voice was calm, almost bored. He set the tray down and began arranging the dishes with methodical precision, ignoring the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "The coffee." Damien gestured vaguely toward the empty cup. "Bring me another." "You've had 4. "I'm counting." "I'm aware." Liam reached for the cup, but instead of refilling it, he placed it on the serving tray alongside the coffee pot. "You're done for the morning. I don't recall asking you to make that decision." "You didn't." Liam's gray-green eyes met Damien's with unwavering calm. "That's the problem. You never ask. You just keep going until your body gives out, and then you expect someone else to clean up the mess." The servants in the room seemed to stop breathing. One of the young maids pressed herself against the wall, clearly preparing to flee at the first sign of violence. A bodyguard stationed near the door shifted his weight, hand resting on his sidearm. Damien leaned back in his chair. "You've become very brave." "No." Liam slid the breakfast plate closer to him. "I've become very tired." "Is there a difference?" "Ask me again when you've slept more than 4 hours." Damien's jaw tightened. The reports on the table blurred in front of him. He'd been working through the night again, as he always did, because sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford and dreams were something he'd trained himself to avoid. The estate required constant attention. The family required constant management. His enemies required constant vigilance. There was no room for weakness, no time for rest. "You have meetings," he said flatly. "You also have a pulse." Liam folded his arms, a gesture that had become as familiar as it was infuriating. "Meetings can wait." "They can't." "They will." The Omega's voice carried an edge of stubborn warmth. "You skipped dinner." "I wasn't hungry." "You skipped lunch too." "I was busy." "And yesterday's breakfast." Damien didn't answer. He couldn't deny the accusation, and he wouldn't pretend it mattered. What mattered was the empire he'd built, the power he'd accumulated, the legacy he'd spent his entire life constructing. What mattered was never showing weakness, never admitting need, never giving anyone the leverage to use against him. Liam sighed. It was a soft sound, almost fond, and it made something twist unexpectedly in Damien's chest. "I keep count," the Omega said quietly. I always have. The corner of one elderly butler's mouth twitched. Everyone in the mansion secretly enjoyed these daily battles. Not because they expected Liam to win, but because somehow he usually did. Damien glared at the plate of food. "One bite," he said finally. "Nothing more." "Good." Liam nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Progress. Don't look so proud. I'll look however I want. You're not my boss." The Omega paused. "Well, technically you are. But you've never acted like it, so I'm not sure the title applies." "You?" "One bite. That's more than yesterday. I'll take what I can get." Damien picked up his fork, stabbed a piece of egg, and shoved it into his mouth with deliberate defiance. The taste was good. It was always good. Liam's cooking had a way of warming him from the inside out, filling spaces he hadn't realized were empty. He hated how much he liked it. "The coffee," he said as Liam turned toward the door. "No. I'll have 1 cup. 2 hours after breakfast. Not before. You don't give orders here." Liam looked back over his shoulder. Neither does caffeine. For a moment, nobody moved. Then, to everyone's astonishment, the feared Mafia boss quietly reached for the toast instead. A collective breath swept through the room. One of the accountants whispered under his breath, "He did it again." The old butler beside him shook his head. "No," he murmured. "He reminds him he's still human." That strange routine became the favorite entertainment of the estate. If Damien worked through lunch, Liam appeared. If he stayed in his office until midnight, the Omega somehow found him. If he ordered everyone to leave, Liam ignored the order completely. Once, Liam walked into a strategy meeting involving senior members of the organization carrying nothing more dangerous than a bowl of chicken soup. The room had gone silent the moment he entered. Maps covered the walls. Phones rang nonstop. Men discussed shipments worth millions. And Liam walked straight through them, his worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder, his expression utterly serene. He placed the bowl beside Damien. "You forgot lunch." "I'm busy." Damien didn't look up from the papers in front of him. "So is your immune system." Several men stared at the table. Nobody dared smile. "Eat first," Liam said. "We can discuss the shipment after." "I'll eat later." "You said that 6 hours ago." Damien finally looked up. "Who exactly do you think you are?" "The only employee willing to argue with you before your blood sugar makes you impossible." A dangerous silence followed. One captain quietly prepared himself for an explosion. Instead, Damien let out something so rare that nobody reacted at first. A sigh. Long, defeated, almost human. He picked up the spoon. The entire room relaxed. Someone actually smiled. As Liam walked toward the door, he spoke without turning around. "See, you can win arguments after lunch, too." Even Damien couldn't stop the corner of his mouth from moving. Barely. But Liam noticed. He always noticed. What nobody else understood was that he never challenged Damien's authority. He challenged his habits. There was a difference. Everyone feared the man. Liam worried about him. Unfortunately, concern often sounded a lot like defiance, and Damien had spent too many years surrounded by people who obeyed him to recognize the difference. 3 days after Liam's departure, a delegation arrived at the estate. The dining room sparkled beneath crystal chandeliers. Every chair was occupied. Every course had been timed perfectly. Everything looked flawless until Damien reached inside his jacket pocket and felt the familiar weight of his small silver flask. Not whiskey, but double-strength espresso concentrate. He was reaching for it when a voice cut through the conversation. "No." The word came from across the room, sharp and commanding. Damien's head snapped up. For a moment, he saw Liam standing by the serving table, arms folded, expression defiant. Then the vision faded, replaced by the empty space where his chef used to stand. The dining room had gone quiet. Guests exchanged confused glances. The conversation around the table had died the moment the word left his lips. Damien forced a smile. "Excuse me," he murmured, sliding the flask back into his pocket. "I meant nothing." It wasn't nothing. Everything felt wrong. The food tasted empty. The room felt hollow. The absence of Liam's stubborn voice, his warm presence, his impossible persistence. It pressed against Damien's chest like a physical weight. He pushed his plate away after one bite. "This isn't right," he muttered. The new chef, a nervous beta who'd been hired 3 days ago, swallowed hard. "It's the same recipe, sir." "No." Damien stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "It isn't." He walked out of the dining room and didn't look back. The mansion lasted exactly 43 minutes without Liam. That was how long it took before breakfast turned into complete chaos. One cook overcooked the eggs. Another served sourdough instead of rye. Someone replaced fresh rosemary with dried oregano. Nobody noticed the mistakes except Damien. By lunchtime, 3 chefs had been dismissed. One had added too much salt. Another had forgotten fresh pepper. The third had prepared everything perfectly, which somehow irritated Damien even more. The old butler watched the kitchen descend into panic before quietly saying something no one dared say aloud. Perhaps it was never just about the food. No one answered. Everyone was thinking the same thing. For the first time in years, the mansion was silent. Not peaceful, empty. There were no sarcastic remarks floating out of the kitchen. No arguments over coffee. No voice reminding the boss that skipping meals was not a personality trait. Even the clocks seemed louder. That afternoon, while searching for an old menu in the kitchen office, the housekeeper opened the bottom drawer of Liam's desk. Inside lay a neatly organized folder, medical receipts, savings records, cooking notes, and one envelope. Across the front in careful handwriting were 4 simple words. Resignation letter. The date stopped everyone cold. It had been signed 3 weeks earlier. The housekeeper rushed the folder to Damien's office. He stared at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. There was no complaint, no accusation, no mention of being fired. Only a brief note. "Thank you for letting me cook here. I only hope that one day you'll remember to eat before your coffee gets cold." He read it again. Then a third time. The letter had been written long before their argument. Liam hadn't left because Damien fired him. He had already decided to leave. That realization unsettled Damien far more than the resignation itself. His head of security entered quietly. Marcus was a solid man, a beta who'd served the family for over a decade. His expression was carefully neutral. "We found nothing suggesting he's accepted another position," he reported. "No restaurant, no private client, no hotel, no competitors." "Then why leave?" Damien's voice was flat, controlled. "We're still looking." For the first time in years, Damien ordered an investigation that had nothing to do with rival families or criminal business. He wanted to know where his chef had gone. 2 days later, the answer arrived. The report was surprisingly thin. No luxury apartment, no expensive car, no secret employer. Instead, there was a modest 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, regular hospital visits, a long list of medical appointments, and years of bank transfers sent to the same university account. Damien turned another page. The account belonged to Liam's younger brother. Every semester's tuition was paid by Liam, with meticulous records stretching back 8 years. Marcus spoke softly. "According to our investigation, he's been supporting his brother since he was 16. Both parents passed away when the boy was young. Liam raised him alone." Damien remained silent. The file revealed more: medical diagnoses, recommended surgeries, treatment delays due to financial hardship. Each postponement was noted in Liam's neat handwriting, each one pushing his own health further to the side in favor of his brother's education. "He never spends money on himself," Marcus continued carefully. "The landlord said the apartment is sparse. He owns only 2 winter coats. The newer one is 8 years old. He repairs his own shoes. He takes leftovers from the mansion kitchen home for dinner." Damien leaned back in his chair. His jaw tightened as he remembered every argument they'd ever had. Liam always insisted on buying the cheapest ingredients for himself, yet somehow managed to serve him the freshest produce available. He packed leftovers to take home. He never complained about the long hours or the demanding schedule. Damien had assumed he was simply frugal. He had never wondered why. "There's more," Marcus said hesitantly. "The medical records show he's been recommended for surgery 3 times. Each time, he's postponed. The last postponement was 6 months ago. According to the doctor's notes, he cited family obligations as the reason. The brother, Damien said. Yes, sir. The brother is in his final year of university. The tuition is substantial, combined with the medical costs. He couldn't afford both. No, sir. He chose his brother's education over his own health. Damien closed the file. His hands were steady, but something was happening inside him that he couldn't control. The careful walls he'd constructed around himself were cracking, and all he could see was Liam's face. That quiet, patient expression, those steady gray-green eyes that had never once looked at him with fear. What else? He asked. There's more. I can tell. Marcus hesitated. The investigation also uncovered that he volunteers every Saturday at a community center on the east side. He teaches cooking classes to underprivileged children. No salary. No publicity. He just shows up. Damien's throat tightened. Every Saturday. For 2 years, sir. The same 2 years he was working here. He would finish his shifts at the mansion and then spend his only day off teaching children how to cook. Without compensation. Without anything. The center's director said he refused payment. He said the children were payment enough. Damien stared at the wall. He could see Liam's face, hear his voice, remember every moment of warmth and stubbornness and impossible patience. The Omega had spent 2 years taking care of everyone except himself. He's been taking care of me, Damien realized. He's been taking care of his brother. He's been taking care of the children. Who's been taking care of him? The answer was no one. Late that night, unable to sleep, Damien wandered into the now quiet kitchen. Everything was spotless, exactly as Liam had always left it. The copper pots still hung above the island. The old wooden cutting board still carried tiny knife marks from years of hurried dinners. Even the herb garden outside the window had grown as it always did. His eyes settled on a small notebook tucked behind a row of cookbooks. He opened it. There were no recipes inside, only tiny reminders written in Liam's careful hand. Boss skipped breakfast again. Add more fruit tomorrow. He looks exhausted today. Less coffee, more tea. Remember to hide vegetables in the pasta sauce. He'll never notice. He's been working too hard. Try to get him to eat something warm. He lost a shipment today. Comfort food. Maybe something with cheese. His scent was off this morning. He's stressed. Need to make something calming. Damien's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Page after page, entry after entry, all of them about him. Liam had been tracking his habits, his moods, his health. Not because he had to, but because he cared. Then he reached the final page. A single, unfinished sentence. I hope he'll learn to take care of himself before. The rest of the page was blank. Damien stared at it for a very long time. The words blurred in front of him, and something painful tightened in his chest, something he'd spent years training himself not to feel. For the first time since Liam walked away, he realized that the man he thought had been challenging his authority had quietly been protecting his life all along. He closed the notebook and placed it carefully back where he'd found it. Then he walked out of the kitchen, through the silent hallways, and into his office. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. All he could see was Liam's face. All he could hear was the Omega's voice saying you're 30 seconds too late. For the first time in nearly 15 years, Damien Ashcroft canceled an entire afternoon of meetings. No one questioned the decision. His advisors assumed a rival family had made an unexpected move. His security team expected an emergency. Instead, the feared Mafia boss sat alone in his office, staring at a single address printed on a sheet of paper. It wasn't a warehouse. It wasn't a safe house. It wasn't the home of an enemy. It was an old community center on the east side of the city. Liam Bennett spent every Saturday there. No salary, no publicity, no sponsors. He just showed up, week after week, because he believed the children deserved a place where nobody expected them to be perfect. Damien exchanged his tailored suit for a simple gray sweater and dark jeans. He pulled a baseball cap low over his face and told his security team to stay back. Sir, are you sure about this? Marcus asked, his voice carrying barely concealed alarm. If someone recognizes you, I'm going to observe. What if you're attacked? Then I'll be attacked. Damien pulled the cap lower. Stay close. Don't interfere. Understood. Marcus nodded reluctantly. Understood. The community center occupied an aging brick building squeezed between a library and a flower shop. Children's laughter echoed through the open windows long before Damien reached the entrance. A hand-painted sign hung above the door. Free cooking class today. Inside, nearly 20 children crowded around stainless steel tables that had seen better days. Flour dust floated through the air like snow. Someone had spilled milk. 2 boys were arguing over a whisk. 3 little girls proudly showed off cookies that looked nothing like cookies. And in the middle of the cheerful chaos, Liam stood wearing a faded blue apron. He looked different, not because of his clothes. He'd always dressed simply, practically, without any concern for appearances. He looked different because he was smiling. Not the polite smile he wore inside the mansion. Not the amused smile he used before winning another argument. This smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and lighting up his whole face. He laughed so freely that the entire room seemed brighter. Damien stopped walking. For a brief moment, he wondered whether he had ever truly seen Liam before. A little boy tugged on Liam's sleeve. Mr. Liam, my pancakes look funny. Liam crouched beside him. They're supposed to look funny. But perfect circles are boring. He held up the oddly shaped pancake. See this? It's a masterpiece. But it's not round. Does it have to be round to be delicious? The boy considered this carefully. No, my pancakes always taste good. Exactly. Liam smiled. What matters is how they taste, not how they look. Another child, a little girl with flour on her nose, raised her hand. What about my turtle pancake? Is it good? Liam's face lit up with genuine delight. A turtle pancake? I've never seen one of those before. You're a genius. The girl beamed. Damien found himself smiling before he realized it. The sight of Liam surrounded by children, patient and warm and completely at ease, was so different from anything he'd witnessed in the mansion that it felt like meeting a stranger. A volunteer noticed him standing near the entrance. Here for the class? Damien hesitated. Yes. Before he could invent an excuse, Liam looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room. For half a second, surprise crossed Liam's face. Then it disappeared, replaced by something unreadable. He simply smiled politely. New student, he announced to the class. Every child turned toward the door. 20 pairs of curious eyes studied Damien with varying degrees of suspicion. A little boy in the front row whispered loudly, "He doesn't look like a chef." "I can see that," Liam said. "That's why he's here. To learn." Damien walked forward, hyper-aware of every step, every breath, every gaze fixed on him. He'd faced down armed rivals without flinching. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals with men who wanted him dead. Nothing had prepared him for 20 children staring at him like he was a strange creature from another planet. 10 minutes later, the most feared Mafia boss in the city found himself wearing a bright yellow apron covered in cartoon vegetables. One of the children pointed at his chest. "It has carrots on it." Another one giggled. "And onions. Smiling onions." Damien looked down at himself. He'd negotiated with crime families, faced armed rivals, survived assassination attempts. Nothing had prepared him for smiling onions. Liam walked over carrying a cutting board. First lesson. He placed an onion in front of Damien. "Dice it." Damien reached for the knife with the same confidence he used for everything in his life. Within seconds, the onion rolled off the board. The knife slipped harmlessly onto the counter. The children burst into laughter. The little boy in the front row raised his hand. "Mister, have you ever cooked before?" Damien answered honestly. "No." The boy nodded thoughtfully. I could tell. Even Liam had to bite his lip to hide a laugh. It didn't work. A soft chuckle escaped him, warm and familiar, and something in Damien's chest loosened. "That's enough," Liam said, retrieving the fallen onion. "We'll start slow. Focus on holding the knife properly." The next assignment wasn't much better. Damien burned garlic, overmixed pancake batter, nearly dropped an entire bowl of flour. At one point, He somehow managed to set off the smoke alarm without actually cooking anything. The children cheered. I don't think that was supposed to happen, Damien said, looking around awkwardly. A tiny girl, no older than 6, nodded with complete seriousness. I don't think so either. The room exploded with laughter. For a moment, Damien felt something unfamiliar, something that might have been amusement. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed without calculation, without strategy, without some hidden purpose driving the sound. Liam was watching him. When their eyes met, the Omega's expression softened. You're not as bad as you think, he said quietly. For a first attempt. Was that a compliment? It was a statement of fact. Liam. Damien's voice came out rougher than intended. I need to talk to you. After class. The Omega turned away, already focused on a group of children who were trying to make cupcakes. I'm busy right now. Damien stood there, apron covered in cartoon vegetables, surrounded by flour and laughter, and children who had no idea who he was. He felt unmoored, untethered from everything he knew. And for the first time in years, he didn't hate it. The class continued for another hour. Damien found himself actually enjoying it, the chaos of it, the mess, the complete lack of pretense. The children didn't care who he was. They didn't know about the empire he'd built or the lives he'd destroyed. They just saw a very tall man in a very silly apron who couldn't dice an onion to save his life. When class ended, the children rushed outside carrying small paper bags filled with the treats they had made. One little boy hugged Liam tightly before leaving. See you next Saturday, he said. I'll be here. Liam smiled. Another child handed Damien a badly decorated cookie. For trying, she said solemnly. He accepted it as though it was something priceless. Thank you. When the room finally grew quiet, Liam began wiping down the tables. He didn't look at Damien. I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to come. I noticed. Liam smiled faintly. The onions gave you away. For the first time since Liam had left the mansion, their conversation sounded almost normal. No shouting, no arguments, only silence stretching comfortably between them. Damien glanced around the room. You do this every Saturday? For free. I had someone teach me when I was little. Liam shrugged. So now I teach them. They deserve one place where nobody expects them to be perfect. Liam's hands paused on the counter. His back was to Damien, but the Omega's shoulders tensed slightly. That's what I believe, he said quietly. Everyone deserves a place where they can just be, without having to prove something. Damien thought about the mansion, about the endless performance of power and control, about the way he'd trained himself never to show weakness, never to admit need, never to let anyone see the cracks in his armor. He thought about how Liam had spent 2 years chipping away at those defenses, not with aggression, but with stubborn warmth that refused to be discouraged. You do this every week, Damien said. You give your Saturdays to these children, your money to your brother's education, and your time to a man who didn't appreciate it. Who do you take care of? Liam turned around, and something flashed in his eyes. I'm taking care of someone now, he said quietly. Myself. The words hit Damien like a punch to the chest. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? He'd fired Liam. He'd humiliated him in front of everyone. He'd pushed away the one person who had ever bothered to see him as something other than a monster. I read your resignation letter, Damien said finally. I saw the date. Liam's expression flickered. You found that? Your housekeeper did. She showed me everything. Damien stepped closer, suddenly aware of the space between them. I read about your brother. About the medical appointments. He swallowed hard. About everything you were hiding. Liam didn't look away. I wasn't hiding. I was handling it. You were suffering alone. I was surviving. The Omega's voice carried an edge of sharpness now. There's a difference. I was paying my brother's tuition. I was saving for surgery. I was doing what I had to do. But you didn't tell me. Why would I? You were my employer, not my confidant. Liam's hands clenched at his sides. You paid me to cook. That's it. You never asked about my life, my health, my plans. Why would you start now? Damien felt the accusation like a physical blow. Because he deserved it. He'd spent 2 years taking Liam's care for granted, accepting his warmth without giving anything in return. I'm asking now, Damien said quietly. I'm standing here, in this ridiculous apron, asking you to let me try. Liam studied him for a long moment. His gray-green eyes searched Damien's face, looking for something, sincerity, perhaps, or some sign that this wasn't another power play. They're starting treatment next week, Liam said finally. The surgery I've been postponing. I'm going in on Thursday. Then I'll be there. I know you don't need me. Damien stepped closer into Liam's space, close enough to see the flecks of gold in the Omega's eyes. But I need to be there. I need to show you. He stopped, searching for words that didn't exist. I spent 2 years letting you take care of me. Let me take care of you now. Just this once. Liam's expression softened. Something unreadable passed between them, a moment of recognition that felt almost like hope. You're impossible, the Omega murmured. I learned from the best. Liam laughed, a real laugh, and Damien felt the sound settle somewhere deep in his chest. You're still impossible, he repeated. I'm trying. That counts for something. Maybe. Liam stepped back, his smile lingering. You can start by cleaning the tables. I need to pack up. Damien picked up a sponge. It was possibly the most mundane task he'd ever performed, and yet it felt more significant than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. He moved methodically, wiping down the stainless steel surfaces while Liam worked beside him in comfortable silence. Somewhere between cleaning and packing, their hands brushed. The contact was brief, barely a second, but Damien felt it like a spark. He looked up and found Liam watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Same time next week? Liam asked. I don't know. Damien paused, the sponge dripping in his hand. I'll be at the hospital on Thursday. But if you want me here on Saturday, I'll find a way to be here. Liam considered this. You're going to come to the hospital? He sounded genuinely surprised. I told you I would. You don't have to. I want to. The words came out rough, almost fierce. I spent 2 years not seeing what was right in front of me. I'm done making that mistake. Liam's cheeks colored slightly. His Omega scent, warm spices and something floral, impossible to name, intensified for just a moment before he suppressed it. We'll see, he said carefully. I'm not making any promises. That's fine. Damien set down the sponge. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking for a chance. The Omega's hand brushed against his again, longer this time. You've got one, he said softly. Don't waste it. Thursday morning arrived with gray skies and a chill that crept through the hospital corridors. Damien stood in the waiting room, his tailored suit exchanged for a simple button-down and dark slacks. He'd cleared his schedule, the first time in years he'd taken a full day off for any reason, and he'd arrived 2 hours before the surgery was scheduled, unable to sleep through the night. Marcus stood guard near the entrance, his presence a silent reassurance. You know he might not want to see you, he said carefully. He might not be ready. I know. Damien didn't look away from the doors that separated the waiting area from the surgical wing. But I'm going to be here anyway. He's a stubborn man, sir. He might push you away. Probably. Damien's smile was grim. That's fine. I've spent enough time pushing people away. I can handle being on the receiving end for a while. Liam was wheeled in 45 minutes later, his brother, a young man barely out of his teens, walking beside the gurney. The Omega looked pale, his usual confidence dimmed by exhaustion and nerves. But when he saw Damien, something flickered in his eyes. You came, he said, his voice hoarse. I told you I would. Liam's brother looked between them with obvious curiosity. You're the boss, he asked bluntly. The one my brother cooked for? That's me. And you fired him? I did. Damien didn't flinch. I was wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things. Liam's brother nodded slowly. Okay. That's okay. Everyone makes mistakes. Liam smiled faintly. He's not wrong. You make a lot of mistakes. I'm trying to fix them. Good. The Omega's eyes drifted closed for a moment. Trying is the important part. The surgery took 6 hours. Damien didn't move from his seat. He didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't answer the calls that came through his phone. He sat in that chair, thinking about everything he'd lost and everything he might still have a chance to save. When the surgeon finally emerged, Damien was on his feet before the door fully opened. The surgery was successful, the doctor said. He's in recovery. He'll need rest, but he's going to be fine. Damien's knees nearly buckled. Can I see him? Visiting hours are over, but I'm not asking as a visitor. Damien's voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. I'm asking as someone who needs to see him. The surgeon studied him for a moment. Family only. Damien stopped. What was he? Liam's employer? His friend? Something more? He didn't have the words for what they were becoming. I'm not family, he admitted. But I'm not leaving until I see him. The surgeon sighed. You can have 5 minutes. No more. Liam was asleep when Damien entered the room. His face was pale against the white hospital pillows, and there were tubes and monitors everywhere, but he was breathing. Alive. Recovering. Damien pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. He reached out, hesitated, then gently took Liam's hand. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry for all of it. For not seeing. For not listening. For pushing you away. He pressed his forehead to their joined hands. I spent 2 years building walls, and you spent 2 years trying to tear them down. I didn't know how to let anyone in. I still don't. But I want to learn. Liam's fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then settling on Damien's face. You're still here, he murmured. Where else would I be? Anywhere else. Liam's voice was weak, but his smile was real. You have meetings. An empire to run. People to intimidate. They can wait. Damien squeezed his hand. I'm not going anywhere. Liam's eyes drifted closed again, but his fingers tightened around Damien's. Good, he breathed. That's good. Liam's recovery was slow but steady. Damien visited him every day. He brought food from the mansion's kitchen, prepared by the new chefs who still couldn't replicate Liam's recipes. He sat by the hospital bed and told Liam about his day, about the meetings he'd canceled, about the ways he was trying to change. I went to the community center, Damien said one afternoon. Without you. The kids asked where you were. What did you tell them? The truth. That you were getting better. That you'd be back soon. He paused. The turtle pancake girl asked if I would teach her how to cook for you. She wanted to make you a get-well meal. Liam laughed weakly. She's a good kid. She'll grow up to be something wonderful. She already is. You're getting soft. Liam's voice was teasing, but his eyes were warm. Maybe. Damien shrugged. Maybe I needed to. The Omega's fingers curled around his hand. The gesture was gentle, almost tentative, as though Liam wasn't sure he was allowed to reach out. I think you did, he murmured. I think you needed someone to remind you that you were human. I had you for that. You fired me. And I spent every day since regretting it. Damien squeezed his hand carefully, aware of the 4 lines and monitors and everything that made Liam fragile. I'm not going to waste another day pretending I don't need you. Liam's breath caught. His scent shifted again, that warm spice floral combination that made Damien's head spin. We don't know what's next, he said softly. The surgery went well, but I don't. I can't make promises. My life is complicated right now. So is mine. That's not reassuring. Damien smiled. I don't need reassuring. I just need you to let me try. Let me be here. Let me prove that I can be the person you thought I was. Liam's hand tightened on his. You already are, he murmured. You just didn't know it. 3 weeks later, Liam was discharged. The mansion's kitchen had been prepared for his return, but when Damien picked him up from the hospital, the Omega hesitated in the driveway. I'm not ready to go back, Liam said quietly. Not yet. I need time. Damien nodded immediately. Whatever you need. I want to go home. To my apartment. To the place I've been paying for without ever really living there. Liam met his eyes. I need to find out who I am when I'm not cooking for you. You don't have to cook for me. Damien's voice was rough. I just want you in my life. However that looks. Whatever you need it to be. Liam's smile was soft, almost shy. Even if I'm not wearing a chef's uniform? Especially then. Damien leaned closer, his voice dropping. I spent 2 years watching you take care of me. Let me take care of you now. The apartment was modest, a small one-bedroom with sparse furnishings and the faint scent of dust. Liam's brother had kept it clean, but it was clear no one had really lived here. The walls were bare. The kitchen was practically empty. Damien stepped inside and immediately began cataloging what was missing. He'd already arranged for groceries. He'd already spoken to Liam's brother about the tuition payments. He'd already started making a list of everything the Omega needed that he'd never allowed himself to want. You don't have to do this, Liam said from the doorway. His voice was careful, guarded. I know you feel guilty. This isn't guilt. Damien turned to face him. This is me trying. This is me saying I want you in my life, whatever that means. If you need space, I'll give you space. If you need time, I'll give you time. But I'm not walking away again. Liam stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him. He crossed the small room, stopping just in front of Damien, close enough to feel the warmth radiating between them. You really mean that, he murmured. I do. Even though I'm stubborn. Even though I argue with you. Even though I don't know what comes next. Especially then. Damien reached up, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped Liam's jaw. I spent 15 years building walls. You were the first person who ever tried to tear them down. I'm not going to rebuild them now. Liam's eyes were bright, almost wet. You're making this very difficult. Good. Difficult is the opposite of impossible. Damien leaned closer, his forehead resting against Liam's. We can figure this out. Together. Whatever it looks like. The Omega's breath hitched. His hand rose, pressing against Damien's chest, over his heartbeat. Together, he repeated, almost tasting the word. And then Damien kissed him. It was gentle, tentative, an offering of everything he couldn't yet say. Liam's lips were soft, and his scent wrapped around Damien like a warm embrace. In that small, sparse apartment, surrounded by all the things Liam had sacrificed and all the dreams he'd postponed, they found something neither of them had expected. A beginning. A month later, the community center held its annual fundraiser. Liam had recovered fully from his surgery. His brother's tuition was paid. The medical bills were settled. And Damien Ashcroft, feared Mafia boss, had become a regular fixture at the Saturday cooking classes, where he'd somehow transformed from a complete disaster into a merely adequate cook. The fundraiser was a small affair. Potluck dinner in the community center's main hall, attended by families and volunteers and children who'd grown up in the classes. The center's director had asked Liam to give a speech, and the Omega had reluctantly agreed. Damien stood in the back of the room, watching Liam approach the small stage. The Omega was wearing a simple navy shirt and dark jeans, no apron, no uniform. He looked happy. He looked like himself. I started these classes because I wanted to give kids a place where they didn't have to be perfect, Liam said, his voice carrying across the crowded room. Where they could make mistakes and learn and grow without being judged. I didn't realize I needed that too. Several people laughed softly. 2 years ago, I started working for a man who didn't know how to take care of himself. Liam's eyes found Damien in the back of the room. He was stubborn. Impossible. He made me want to pull my hair out. More laughter. Damien felt his cheeks warm. But he was also worth it. Liam's voice softened. He was worth arguing with. Worth fighting for. Worth staying for. Even when it seemed like he didn't want me there. The room had gone quiet, everyone listening. I don't know what comes next, Liam continued. I don't know where this story goes. But I know I'm done pretending I don't deserve good things. His eyes were locked on Damien's now, warm and steady. I'm done hiding. I'm done sacrificing myself for people who don't appreciate it. I'm done being afraid. Damien's chest tightened. He stepped forward, moving through the crowd, walking toward the stage without conscious thought. Liam met him at the edge of the platform. What are you doing? He murmured. Showing up, Damien said. That's all you ever asked me to do. The crowd parted around them as Damien climbed the small steps. He faced the room. All those families, those children, those people who had no idea who he really was. And for the first time in his life, he didn't care. I'm the man Liam was talking about, he announced. The one who didn't know how to take care of himself. The one who fired the best thing that ever happened to him. He paused, letting the words settle. I don't know what comes next either. But I know I'm going to spend every day trying to be worthy of him. Liam's eyes were bright. You're making a scene. Good. Scenes are memorable. The children in the audience started clapping. The parents followed. Within moments, the entire room was filled with applause and whistles and laughter. Liam reached for his hand. You're ridiculous, he said softly. I know. Damien squeezed his fingers. But you already knew that. I did. The Omega smiled, warm and real and full of everything they'd been building together. I always knew. That night, they returned to the mansion. The kitchen glowed with warm light. Copper pots hung above the island. Fresh herbs grew in the garden outside the window. And at the center of it all, two men stood together, side by side, figuring out how to make something new. Liam reached for the partnership apron, the one Damien had embroidered, the one that had sat untouched for weeks, and tied it around his waist. The fabric settled against his chest like a promise. Are you ready for this? Damien asked. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for a knife. I've been ready for years. Liam smiled, taking the knife from Damien's hand and guiding his fingers into the correct position. You're the one who needed to catch up. I'm catching up now. I know. Liam's hand rested over Damien's, warm and solid. That's what matters. They cooked together in the comfortable silence that had always existed between them. The silence of two people who understood each other without needing words. The room filled with the scent of garlic and herbs, the sizzle of oil, the warmth of something being created. When the meal was ready, they sat on the kitchen floor, sharing the same plate, talking about nothing and everything. The mansion loomed around them, powerful and imposing, but inside the kitchen, inside the space they'd built together, there was only warmth. I don't know what happens next, Damien said finally. I don't know how to be the person you deserve. You don't have to know. Liam's eyes met his. You just have to keep trying. Is that enough? It's everything. The Omega leaned closer, his forehead resting against Damien's. Trying is everything. It's what makes you different from everyone else. It's what makes you worth fighting for. Damien's arms wrapped around him, pulling Liam close. I never thought I'd have this, he murmured. I never thought I'd want it. But now that I have it, I'm not letting go. Good, Liam breathed. Because I'm not letting go either. Outside, the estate stood powerful and untouchable, the same as it always had. Inside, something new was being built. Something fragile and precious and completely unexpected. They had started with arguments and coffee and stubbornness. They had found their way to forgiveness and partnership and hope. And whatever came next, they would face it together. 3 months later, the mansion was full of children. The community center had closed for renovations, and Liam had offered the estate's kitchen as a temporary location for the Saturday cooking classes. The children had arrived with wide eyes and whispered questions, marveling at the size of the room, the gleaming appliances, the enormous island where they could spread out their ingredients. And in the middle of it all stood Damien Ashcroft, wearing a yellow apron covered in cartoon vegetables, patiently helping a 6-year-old girl form her pancake batter into the shape of a turtle. More flour, the girl instructed. You're doing it wrong. I'm doing it wrong. Yes. She nodded seriously. Mr. Liam showed me. You're supposed to be gentle. Damien adjusted his technique. Like this. Better. Still not perfect. Nothing is perfect, Damien said, and he meant it. That's what makes it wonderful. The girl considered this. That's what Mr. Liam says. Mr. Liam is very smart. He is. The girl grinned, her face covered in flour. He's the smartest person I know. Liam watched from across the room, his heart full. The children had accepted Damien without reservation, seeing only the man who burned garlic and couldn't dice onions, and always showed up. They didn't know about the empire he'd built. They didn't care. All they saw was someone who was trying. And that, Liam had learned, was the most important thing of all. The classes continued for 4 weeks. Each Saturday, the mansion's kitchen filled with laughter and flour and the scent of things being created. The staff, initially intimidated by the invasion, eventually came to look forward to the chaos. Even Marcus, the ever-vigilant head of security, was seen smiling at the sight of the boss covered in batter. On the final Saturday, before the community center reopened, Liam gathered the children in a circle. "I want to thank you all for coming here," he said. "I know it's not the same as our regular place, but you made it special. You made it home." The children cheered. The turtle pancake girl raised her hand. "Are you coming back? To the community center?" "Every Saturday," Liam promised. "Just like always." "And is Mr. Damien coming too?" another child asked. All eyes turned to Damien, who had frozen mid-chop. He looked at Liam, unsure how to answer. "Yes," Liam said, smiling. "Mr. Damien is coming too. He's part of the class now." "He has to," the turtle pancake girl said. "He's finally getting good at the onions." Damien laughed, actually laughed, the sound filling the room with warmth. "I'm getting better," he agreed. "Not good. Better." "Better is good enough," Liam said, and their eyes met across the room. For a moment, surrounded by children and chaos and the smell of baking bread, everything was perfect. That evening, after the last child had been picked up and the kitchen had been cleaned, Damien and Liam stood together in the quiet room. The copper pots gleamed. The herb garden outside the window rustled in the evening breeze. "Do you ever miss it?" Damien asked quietly. "The way things used to be." "Which things?" "Before. When you were just the chef and I was just the boss." Liam considered this. "I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted. "When things were clear. When I knew what I was supposed to do." "Do you know now?" "I know I want to be here." Liam stepped closer, his hand finding Damien's. "I know I want to keep cooking. Keep teaching. Keep building something that matters." He paused. "And I know I want to keep doing it with you." Damien's breath caught. His hand tightened around Liam's. "That's all I needed to hear. I've been trying to tell you for 2 years. I know. I wasn't ready to listen. And now." Damien pulled him close, wrapping his arms around the Omega's sturdy frame. "Now I'm ready. Now I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." Liam's laugh was muffled against his shoulder. "That's a very long time." "I know. You're impossible. I learned from the best." Liam pulled back, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I love you," he said. "I think I have for a long time. I just didn't know how to say it." Damien felt the words like a physical blow, a blow that shattered every wall he'd ever built. "I love you too," he said roughly. "I've been too afraid to say it. Too afraid to admit that someone like you could want someone like me." "Someone like you?" Liam's brow furrowed. "You're the most powerful man in the city. And you're the only one who ever made me feel human." Damien's hand rose to cup his jaw. "You made me want to be better. You made me believe I could be. That's more powerful than any empire." Liam kissed him then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of promise and possibility and everything they were becoming. In that moment, surrounded by copper pots and fresh herbs and all the evidence of their shared history, they found something neither of them had ever expected. They found home. The mansion's kitchen became a symbol of everything that had changed. No longer just a place where meals were prepared, it was the heart of the estate, the place where arguments happened and forgiveness grew, where children laughed and adults learned to be gentle, where two men from completely different worlds discovered that they could build something together. Liam continued his Saturday classes. Damien attended every one, his yellow apron a permanent fixture, his skills slowly improving from disastrous to not embarrassing. The children adored him. The staff respected him. And the feared Mafia boss discovered that there was more to life than power. There was connection. There was purpose. There was love. One evening, as they stood together in the quiet kitchen, Liam reached for the partnership apron that hung on the hook by the door. "Do you remember the first time I wore this?" he asked. "I remember the day I gave it to you. The day I forgave you." Liam smiled, running his fingers over the embroidered letters. "I didn't know then what it would mean." "Neither did I." Damien stepped closer, his hand finding Liam's waist. "I thought it was a gesture, an apology, something to make up for what I'd done. And now I know it was a promise." Damien's voice was rough with emotion. A promise to build something better. Something that would last. Liam turned in his arms, the apron pressed between them. Is it lasting? It's just beginning. Damien pressed his forehead to Liam's. We have time. We have patience. We have everything we need. What about everything we want? Damien smiled. That too. We have that too. The years that followed were not without challenges. The criminal empire demanded attention. The family required management. There were threats and betrayals, and all the complications of living in a world built on power. But through it all, the kitchen remained constant. It was where they went when the world became too much. Where they argued and laughed, and found their way back to each other. Where they cooked meals that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with care. Liam's brother graduated from university. The medical bills were paid. The community center expanded, and the cooking classes grew to include more children, more volunteers, more of everything that mattered. And Damien Ashcroft, once the most feared man in the city, became known for something completely unexpected. He became known as the man with the yellow apron. The man who showed up every Saturday. The man who had learned, slowly, painfully, but truly, that power meant nothing without people to share it with. On their 3rd anniversary, they stood together in the kitchen where it all began. The copper pots gleamed. The herb garden flourished. The partnership apron hung on its hook, faded but cherished. I have something for you, Liam said quietly. Damien turned, surprised. Another gift? You've already given me everything. No. Liam reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. I haven't given you this. Damien's breath caught. Liam, I know we're not traditional. Liam smiled, his eyes bright with tears. I know we've never done things the way other people do, but I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Not as your chef, not as your employee, as your partner, as your family. He opened the box. Inside was a simple ring, silver, understated, perfect. I'm not asking you to change anything, Liam continued. I'm not asking you to leave your empire or become someone else. I'm just asking you to let me stay. Let me keep being the one who argues with you about coffee and makes you eat breakfast and reminds you that you're human. Damien's hands were shaking. You're proposing to me? In the kitchen? I don't know how else to do it. Liam laughed, a wet, happy sound. This is where everything started. This is where I fell in love with you. It felt right. Damien pulled him close, kissing him hard and fierce and full of everything he couldn't say. Yes, he said roughly. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Liam laughed against his lips. You didn't let me finish the speech. You had me at partner. You had me from the very first argument. Damien pulled back, his eyes wet with tears he didn't try to hide. I love you. I've loved you since the day you told me coffee wasn't a personality trait. That's a terrible thing to fall in love over. It's the most honest thing anyone ever said to me. They stood together in the kitchen, the ring on Damien's finger, the partnership apron between them, and everything felt exactly right. The news spread through the estate like wildfire. The boss was engaged. The boss had accepted a ring from the Omega chef. The boss was, against all odds, happy. The children at the community center were thrilled. The turtle pancake girl, now 11 years old, had declared that she would be the flower person at the wedding. Liam had laughed and agreed. The ceremony was small, just the children, the volunteers, the household staff who had become family. It took place in the community center, the aging brick building that had witnessed so much of their story. Damien wore a simple suit. Liam wore the same navy shirt he'd worn at the fundraiser, the one that made his eyes glow. And when they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. I spent my whole life building walls, Damien said, his voice rough with emotion. You tore them down, brick by brick, with patience and stubbornness and love. I didn't know I needed you. I didn't know I could need anyone. But now I can't imagine my life without you. Liam's eyes were bright. I spent my whole life taking care of people, he said. I never expected anyone to take care of me. But you did. You showed up. You tried. You made me believe that I deserved good things. He smiled, warm and real, and full of everything they'd built together. I love you. I always will." They kissed, and the children cheered, and somewhere in the back of the room, the old butler from the mansion wiped a tear from his eye. The feared Mafia boss and his Omega partner had found their way home. The kitchen remained the heart of everything. It was where they spent their evenings, side by side, creating meals that nourished more than just their bodies. It was where they argued about ingredients and laughed about disasters, and found comfort in the simple act of cooking together. The community center continued to thrive. The Saturday classes continued to grow. And in the midst of it all, two men from completely different worlds had built something extraordinary. They had built a partnership, a family, a love that had started with arguments and coffee and stubbornness, and had grown into something deeper than either of them had ever expected. The mansion stood powerful and imposing, the same as it always had. But inside its walls, something had changed. Something that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with connection. There was laughter. There was warmth. There was the sound of two people building a life together, one meal at a time. And in the end, that was more powerful than any empire.